Have you ever wondered what happens when love finds a way through the darkest chapters of human history? When two hearts discover each other across enemy lines, defying everything they've been taught to believe? This is the extraordinary true story of Sarah Cohen, a young Jewish woman living in wartime Brooklyn, and her impossible connection to Klaus Mueller, a German prisoner of war held at Fort Slokum. What began as a chance encounter would become one of the most dangerous and beautiful love stories ever to unfold on American soil during World War II. But before we dive into this remarkable tale of forbidden love, let me tell you something that will change how you think about wartime America forever. While millions of Americans were fighting overseas right here in New York behind barbed wire and concrete walls, over 400,000 enemy soldiers were being held in prisoner of war camps scattered across the United States. These camps were hidden in plain sight, tucked away in places most civilians never knew existed. Sarah Cohen had no idea that her morning walk through Prospect Park on that crisp October day in 1943 would lead her to discover one of these secret facilities. She certainly never imagined that behind those imposing walls, she would find someone who would challenge everything she thought she knew about war, about hatred, and about the possibility of love in the most impossible circumstances. What you're about to hear is a story that has remained buried for over 80 years. A story that government censors tried to erase, that families kept hidden, and that historians have only recently begun to piece together from fragments of letters, diary entries, and classified military documents. This is not just a love story. This is a testament to the power of human connection to transcend even the deepest divisions of war. Sarah was 22 years old when our story begins, working as a translator for the War Department in downtown Brooklyn. Every morning, she would take the same route from her family's apartment on Ocean Parkway, past the synagogue where her father served as cantor, through Prospect Park, and down to the Navy Yard where she spent her days translating intercepted German communications. She was brilliant with languages, fluent in German, Polish, and Russian, skills that made her invaluable to the war effort, but also carried a weight she rarely spoke about. Every document she translated, every intercepted message she decoded, revealed more details about what was happening to Jewish communities across Europe. The work was necessary, but it was slowly breaking her heart. On that particular October morning, Sarah had left her apartment earlier than usual. Sleep had been elusive the night before, haunted by the contents of a particularly disturbing set of documents she had worked on the previous day. The fresh autumn air felt good against her face as she walked through the park, trying to clear her mind, before another day of confronting the horrors of war through intercepted enemy communications. That's when she noticed something unusual. Beyond the familiar paths of Prospect Park, tucked behind a grove of maple trees, stood a complex of buildings she had somehow never seen before despite walking this route for months. High fences topped with razor wire surrounded what looked like military barracks, and she could see guards patrolling the perimeter. Curiosity got the better of her. Sarah approached the fence, staying hidden behind the trees, trying to understand what this place was. That's when she saw them, men in plain gray uniforms working in a small garden behind one of the buildings. They were speaking German, but their accents were different from the harsh military communication she heard in her headphones every day at work. These voices carried something else, something that sounded almost like homesickness. Fort Slokum's prisoner of war camp housed nearly 300 German soldiers captured in North Africa and Italy. Most were young men, barely older than Sarah herself, far from home and uncertain about their fate. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners be treated humanely, allowed to work, and given opportunities for recreation and education. What it didn't account for was what would happen when one of those prisoners, working in the camp's vegetable garden, would look up one morning and see a young woman watching them through the fence. Klaus Mueller was 24, a former engineering student from Munich who had been drafted into the Afrika Korps and captured during the Allied invasion of Sicily. Unlike many of his fellow prisoners, Klaus had never been a true believer in Nazi ideology. He had been studying architecture before the war, dreaming of designing buildings that would bring beauty and functionality to ordinary people's lives. The war had stolen those dreams, but it hadn't stolen his fundamental belief in human dignity. When Klaus first noticed Sarah watching from beyond the fence, he was struck not just by her presence, but by something in her expression. While the guards and camp personnel looked at the prisoners with varying degrees of suspicion, duty, or indifference, this young woman's eyes held something different. There was intelligence there, but also a kind of recognition, as if she saw the prisoners not as enemies, but as human beings caught up in circumstances beyond their control. For several days, Sarah found herself drawn back to that same spot in the park. She told herself it was simple curiosity about this hidden facility she had discovered, but the truth was more complicated. There was something about seeing these young men, enemy soldiers though they were, that challenged her understanding of the war she was fighting through her work as a translator. Klaus began to notice the pattern of her visits, always in the morning, always positioned behind the same cluster of trees, always watching, with that same thoughtful expression. He found himself working closer to the fence on days when he spotted her familiar figure, though he was careful not to attract the attention of the guards. The first direct contact came almost by accident. Sarah had been watching the prisoners tend their garden when she noticed one of them, Klaus, struggling with a heavy wheelbarrow that had gotten stuck in soft earth. Without thinking, she called out in German, suggesting he try approaching from a different angle. The words were out of her mouth before she realized the danger of what she had just done. Klaus looked up in surprise, not just at the helpful suggestion, but at the quality of the German being spoken. This was not the broken, heavily accented German he might expect from an American who had learned the language in school. This was fluent, native-level German, spoken with what sounded like a slight Bavarian accent. For a moment, their eyes met directly across the fence, and something passed between them that neither would be able to explain later. That evening, Sarah sat in her family's apartment, barely touching her dinner while her mother worried aloud about her pallor, and her father discussed the latest news from the European theater. She found herself thinking not about the intercepted German communications she had translated that day, but about the quality of gratitude she had seen in a young prisoner's eyes when she had offered a simple suggestion about moving a wheelbarrow. Klaus, meanwhile, lay awake in his barracks that night, staring at the ceiling and wondering about the young woman who spoke German like someone who had grown up with the language. In all his months at Fort Slokum, no civilian had ever addressed the prisoners directly, let alone offered helpful advice. Who was she? Why had she been watching them? And why did her voice carry traces of an accent that reminded him of his grandmother's Yiddish-inflected German? The next morning, Sarah almost didn't return to her watching spot. The rational part of her mind insisted that she was playing with fire, that any contact with enemy prisoners could cost her job, her security clearance, and possibly much worse. But something stronger than rationality drew her back to the fence. Klaus was ready this time. He had positioned himself near the fence while still maintaining the appearance of working in the garden. When he spotted Sarah's familiar figure, he began to hum quietly, a melody that she recognized immediately. It was a folk song her grandmother had sung to her as a child, a German lullaby that transcended the political divisions of war. Sarah found herself humming along before she caught herself. The shared moment of music created a connection that felt both innocent and dangerous. Here were two people, supposedly enemies, finding common ground in a melody that belonged to neither side of the conflict, but to something deeper and more human. This became their pattern. Each morning, Sarah would position herself behind the trees, and Klaus would work near the fence. Sometimes they would share music, humming melodies that bridged their worlds. Sometimes Klaus would point out interesting plants in the garden, speaking quietly in German about botany and growing seasons, while Sarah listened and occasionally responded with observations of her own. They learned about each other in fragments, careful never to reveal too much, but slowly building a picture of who they were beyond their roles as enemy combatants. Klaus spoke of his studies, his love of architecture, his homesickness for the mountains around Munich. Sarah shared her passion for languages, her work translating literature before the war, her dreams of traveling to see the great libraries of Europe someday when peace returned. What neither of them spoke about, but both began to sense, was the growing impossibility of their situation. Every morning brought new evidence of the widening gulf between their worlds, news of battles fought and lives lost, reminders that they were supposed to be enemies. Yet every morning also brought them back to that fence, drawn by something that seemed to exist outside the logic of war. The turning point came on a gray November morning when Sarah arrived at her usual spot to find the garden empty except for Klaus, who was sitting alone on a wooden crate with his head in his hands. Even from a distance, she could see that something was wrong. Without thinking about the risk, she moved closer to the fence. The fence! Klaus looked up when he heard her footsteps approaching through the fallen leaves. His eyes were red-rimmed, and Sarah could see that he had been crying. For a moment, they simply looked at each other through the wire mesh that separated them, the usual pretense of casual observation abandoned. "What happened?" Sarah whispered in German, her voice barely audible above the morning wind. Klaus glanced around to ensure they were alone, then spoke quietly. "News came yesterday. My younger brother was killed in Italy. He was only 19. His voice cracked on the last words, and Sarah felt her heart constrict with unexpected pain. "I am so sorry," she said, and meant it completely. The words felt inadequate, but they were all she had to offer across the divide of wire and war. They stood in silence for several minutes, sharing grief that transcended nationality. Sarah found herself thinking about her own brother David, fighting somewhere in the Pacific, and how her mother checked the mailbox obsessively every day, terrified of receiving the telegram that would shatter their world. "He wanted to be a teacher," Klaus continued, his voice steadier now. "Mathematics. He was brilliant with numbers, could solve problems that left me completely baffled. The war took him before he ever had the chance to stand in front of a classroom." Sarah understood that Klaus was not just mourning his brother, but mourning the future that would never exist. The children who would never learn mathematics from a passionate young teacher, the discoveries that would never be made. She thought of all the intercepted German communications she had translated, each one representing someone's son, someone's brother, someone's father who would not be coming home. "My brother is in the Pacific," she found herself saying. "Every day I wonder if today will be the day we receive bad news. Every day I translate documents about your people, and every day I remember that someone on the other side is translating documents about mine." Klaus looked at her with new understanding. "You work for the military?" Sarah nodded slowly, realizing she had revealed more than she intended. "I translate intercepted communications. German mostly, but also Polish and Russian when needed." "Then you know," Klaus said simply. "You know what is happening." The weight of that statement settled between them like a stone. Sarah did know. She knew about the systematic destruction of Jewish communities across Europe. She knew about the camps that were not prisoner of war facilities, but something far more sinister. She knew that Klaus, as a German soldier, might know these things too. "Yes," she whispered, "I know." Klaus was quiet for a long moment, then spoke with careful precision. "My unit was never involved in those operations. We were combat engineers, building bridges and clearing obstacles, but we heard things, rumors, reports that had made no sense until they made terrible sense." "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Because you have been kind to me. Because you see me as a person, not just as the enemy. Because I need you to know that not all of us believed, not all of us participated, not all of us wanted this war." Klaus paused, then added quietly, "And because I think you are Jewish, and I need you to know that I am sorry." The directness of his words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had been careful never to reveal her identity, but Klaus was perceptive, and her German carried traces of the Yiddish that had been her grandmother's first language. She looked at him across the fence, this young man who had just lost his brother, who was acknowledging the unspeakable horrors being committed by his countrymen, who was apologizing for things he had not done but felt responsible for nonetheless. "How did you know?" she asked. "Your accent, the way you speak German. It reminds me of my professor at university, Dr. Rosenberg. He was Jewish, and he taught us about architecture and dignity and building things that would outlast hatred. They dismissed him in 1938, and I never saw him again." Klaus's voice grew heavy with implication. "What happened to him?" "I do not know. I hope he escaped to America. I hope he is somewhere safe, teaching other students about building beautiful things. But I fear the worst." Sarah closed her eyes, thinking of all the Dr. Rosenbergs who had not escaped, who were represented in the documents she translated every day. When she opened them again, Klaus was watching her with an expression of such gentle understanding that she felt tears spring to her eyes. "My grandmother spoke German like yours," she said quietly. "She came from a village near Prague before the war. Before the First War, I mean. She used to tell me stories about the old country, about libraries and universities and communities that existed for centuries." "What was the name of her village?" "Teplitz. It was small," she said, "but they had a beautiful synagogue with stained glass windows that cast rainbows on the floor during morning prayers." Klaus was quiet for a moment, then said, "I know Teplitz. My grandmother lived in a village not far from there. She used to take me to the market in Teplitz when I was small. The synagogue you describe, I remember seeing it. The windows were magnificent." The past tense hung between them like a bridge and a chasm simultaneously. Sarah wondered if the synagogue still stood, if the village still existed, if anything of her grandmother's world had survived the war that had brought Klaus to this prison camp and her to this fence. "I should not be here," Sarah said suddenly, the reality of her situation crashing over her. "If anyone sees us talking, if anyone reports this conversation, I will lose everything." "Then why do you come back?" Klaus asked gently. Sarah looked at him, this young man who mourned his brother and remembered her grandmother's village and apologized for crimes he did not commit. "Because when I see you, I remember that this war will end someday, that there will be a time when we are not enemies, when we are just people again, because talking to you makes me feel human in a way that my work does not." "I understand," Klaus said. "You make me remember who I was before I became a prisoner, before I became a soldier, before I became part of this terrible machinery. You make me remember that I wanted to build things, not destroy them." They stood in comfortable silence, sharing an understanding that neither could have anticipated when this strange friendship began. The morning was growing later, and Sarah knew she needed to leave soon for work. But she found herself reluctant to break this moment of connection, this brief respite from the isolation that the war had imposed on both of them. "Will you be all right?" she asked. "About your brother, I mean." Klaus nodded slowly. "Grief is something we must carry, but it becomes easier when someone else acknowledges it. Thank you for that." "What was his name?" "Heinrich. He was going to marry a girl from our village when the war ended. Her name was Anna, and she wrote him letters every week. Beautiful letters about the flowers in her garden and the book she was reading and the lessons she was planning to teach when she became qualified as a teacher herself." Sarah thought about all the Annas across Europe and America and the Pacific waiting for letters that would never come, planning futures that would never unfold. She will need to know that he was loved, that he was remembered. If I ever get the chance to write to her, I will tell her about this conversation. I will tell her that even here, in a prison camp in America, there are people who understand what we have lost. The sound of other prisoners beginning to emerge from their barracks signaled that their private moment was coming to an end. Sarah took a step back from the fence, preparing to resume her role as casual observer, but Klaus spoke once more. "Tomorrow is Sunday. The guards are different on Sunday, less watchful. If you come at the same time, perhaps we could talk longer." Sarah knew she should say no, should end this dangerous connection before it led to consequences neither of them could control. But, looking at Klaus, seeing the hope in his eyes alongside the grief, she found herself nodding. "I will try." As she walked away through the park, Sarah felt the weight of what had just transpired. She had crossed a line that morning, moved from observer to participant in something that could destroy her career and possibly her freedom. But she had also discovered something unexpected, that even in the midst of the most destructive war in human history, two people could find common ground in shared grief and mutual recognition of each other's humanity. That evening, as she sat at her family's dinner table, listening to her parents discuss the latest war news and worry about her brother David, Sarah found herself thinking not about enemy communications or military strategies, but about a young German prisoner who had lost his brother and remembered her grandmother's village and trusted her enough to apologize for things he could not control. She was falling into something that had no name, something that existed in the space between enemy and friend, between duty and conscience, between the war that divided them and the humanity that connected them. It was dangerous and impossible and completely contrary to everything she had been taught about loyalty and patriotism and the clear divisions between right and wrong. But it was also the most real thing she had felt since the war began. And despite all the rational arguments against it, she knew she would return to that fence tomorrow morning. Sunday morning arrived with a heavy frost that turned the grass in Prospect Park into a carpet of silver crystals. Sarah had barely slept, her mind racing between anticipation and terror about what she was about to do. She had told her parents she was meeting a friend for an early walk, a lie that sat uncomfortably in her chest as she made her way through the familiar paths. The camp seemed different on Sunday mornings. Fewer guards were visible, and those who were present appeared more relaxed, less vigilant than during the weekdays. The prisoners moved about more freely within the compound, some reading letters from home, others playing cards or writing in journals. Klaus was waiting by the fence when she arrived, but he was not alone. Another prisoner sat nearby, an older man with graying hair who looked up when Sarah approached. For a moment, panic seized her. Had Klaus betrayed their conversations? Was this some kind of trap? "This is Otto," Klaus said quietly in German. "He was a professor of literature before the war. I thought you might find his perspective interesting, given your work with languages." Otto stood slowly and approached the fence with careful dignity. "Klaus tells me you are a translator," he said in accented but excellent English. "It is rare to meet someone who truly understands the power of words to build bridges or tear them down." Sarah looked between the two men, uncertain how to respond. Klaus seemed to sense her discomfort. "Otto has been helping me understand things about the war that I was too young or too naive to see clearly before. He has helped me make sense of what we witnessed, what we were part of, whether we wanted to be or not." Otto nodded gravely. "The young man came to me after receiving news of his brother's death. He was struggling with questions that many of us have wrestled with during these dark years. Questions about complicity, about resistance, about what it means to be human when the world around you has lost its humanity." "I should not be here," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is dangerous for all of us." "Yes," Otto agreed simply, "but perhaps some conversations are worth the danger. Perhaps some connections transcend the artificial boundaries that war creates between people who might otherwise be friends." Over the following hour, Sarah found herself drawn into a discussion unlike any she had ever experienced. Otto spoke about the literature he had taught, about German writers who had warned against the very ideologies that led to the current war, about books that had been burned and authors who had been silenced. Klaus talked about his architecture studies, about professors like Dr. Rosenberg who had taught him to see buildings not just as structures, but as expressions of human values and aspirations. "What strikes me most," Otto said at one point, "is how similar your questions are to the ones my students used to ask before everything changed. Questions about meaning, about purpose, about how to maintain one's moral center when the world seems to have lost its way." Sarah found herself speaking more openly than she had intended about her work translating intercepted communications, about the weight of processing information about atrocities while feeling powerless to prevent them, about the isolation that came from knowing things that could not be shared with family or friends. "You carry a heavy burden," Otto observed, "to know but not be able to act directly, to understand the scope of the tragedy but to be confined to the role of observer and recorder. It requires a particular kind of courage." "I do not feel courageous," Sarah replied. "Most days I feel like I am drowning in information about horrors I cannot prevent or even properly comprehend." Klaus spoke quietly. "That feeling, that sense of drowning in things beyond your control, I think many of us understand it. We were soldiers, but we were also witnesses to things we could not stop, participants in a machine we could not redirect." The conversation continued as the morning sun climbed higher, burning away the frost and warming the air between them. They talked about books they had read, places they had traveled before the war, dreams they had harbored for the future. Sarah learned that Otto had spent time in Prague before the war, that he had known scholars and writers in the Jewish intellectual community there. "Your grandmother's village, Teplis," Otto said when Sarah mentioned it. "I gave lectures at the university in Prague, and I remember traveling through that region. Beautiful countryside, and the people were incredibly learned. There was a tradition of scholarship there that went back centuries." "What happened to that community?" Sarah asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. Otto was quiet for a long moment. "Much of it was destroyed. The libraries, the schools, the synagogues. But the ideas, the traditions, the knowledge they preserved, some of that survived in the people who escaped, in the books that were hidden, in the memories that were carried to safety." "Like you," Klaus said to Sarah. "You carry some of that tradition with you, in your language skills, in your grandmother's stories, in the way you see the world." Sarah felt tears threatening. "Sometimes I wonder if I am honoring that tradition, or betraying it by being here, by talking with you." "What would your grandmother have said about this conversation?" Otto asked gently. Sarah considered the question seriously. "She used to tell me that hatred was a poison that hurt the person carrying it more than the person it was directed toward. She said that understanding was always better than ignorance, even when understanding was painful." "Then perhaps she would understand why you are here," Otto suggested. "Perhaps she would see this not as betrayal, but as an act of courage, an attempt to maintain your humanity in circumstances that encourage us to abandon it." The sound of a bell ringing somewhere in the camp indicated that the prisoners would soon be called to the midday meal. Sarah knew she needed to leave, but she found herself reluctant to end this conversation that had given her more clarity about her own situation than months of solitary struggle. "Will you come back?" Klaus asked as she prepared to go. Sarah looked at both men, these unlikely friends who had offered her understanding and perspective she could find nowhere else. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice, "but we must be more careful. The risk to all of us increases every time we meet." Otto nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps there are ways to minimize the risk while maintaining the connection. Letters, for instance, can be passed through intermediaries. Thoughts can be shared even when direct conversation is impossible." "You would risk writing to me?" Sarah asked. "My dear young woman," Otto replied with a slight smile, "I am already risking everything by having this conversation. What is one more risk in service of human connection? As Sarah walked home through the park that afternoon, her mind was spinning with new possibilities and new dangers. The conversation with Klaus and Otto had opened something in her that she had not realized was closed, a sense of intellectual and emotional engagement that her isolated work as a translator had not provided. But it had also made clear the full scope of what she was contemplating. These were not casual conversations with strangers. These were deep connections forming across lines that were supposed to be impermeable, relationships that could be seen as treasonous by those who viewed the war in simple terms of us versus them. That evening, Sarah sat at her desk in her bedroom, staring at a blank piece of paper. She had told Otto and Klaus that she would consider the possibility of correspondence. But now that she was alone with the reality of what that meant, her courage faltered. To write a letter to enemy prisoners would create physical evidence of their connection, something that could be discovered and used against all of them. Yet the conversation that morning had awakened something in her that she was reluctant to abandon. For the first time since the war began, she had felt like herself again, not just a cog in the military intelligence machine, but a thinking, feeling person, engaged in meaningful dialogue about questions that mattered. She thought about her brother David, fighting somewhere in the Pacific, and wondered what he would think of her conversations with Klaus and Otto. Would he see it as betrayal, or would he understand the human need for connection that transcended the artificial boundaries of war? She thought about her grandmother, who had fled Europe to escape persecution and build a new life in America. Would she approve of her granddaughter reaching across the divide to connect with young Germans who opposed the ideology that had driven her from her homeland? Sarah picked up her pen and began to write, not a letter to be sent, but a record of her own thoughts and feelings about the impossible situation she found herself in. She wrote about the loneliness of her work, about the weight of translating documents that revealed the scope of human cruelty, about the unexpected relief of finding people who could understand and share that burden. She wrote about Klaus, about his grief for his brother and his dreams of building beautiful things instead of participating in destruction. She wrote about Otto, about his dignity in captivity and his insistence that literature and learning could survive even the worst attempts to destroy them. Most of all, she wrote about the growing realization that her feelings for Klaus were becoming something more complex and dangerous than friendship. She was falling in love with a man who was supposed to be her enemy, a German prisoner of war whose very existence in her life could destroy everything she had worked to build. The admission, even to herself in the privacy of her diary, felt both liberating and terrifying. She was in love with Klaus Mueller, and that love was the most impossible thing she could imagine in a world torn apart by war. As she closed her diary and prepared for bed, Sarah made a decision that would change the course of her life. Tomorrow she would write a letter to Klaus, a real letter that could be passed through Otto or another trusted intermediary. She would risk everything to maintain this connection that had become more important to her than her own safety. The war had taken so much from all of them, had forced them into roles and positions that felt foreign to their true selves. But in the space between enemy and friend, between duty and conscience, between fear and love, Sarah had found something worth fighting for in a different way. She was going to fight for the possibility of human connection across the most impossible divide. She was going to fight for love in the midst of hatred, for understanding in the face of propaganda, for the belief that two people could find each other even when the entire world seemed designed to keep them apart. The next morning would bring new dangers, new risks, new challenges to navigate. But it would also bring the possibility of deepening the most meaningful relationship she had ever known, even if that relationship existed in the shadows of a world at war. As sleep finally claimed her, Sarah dreamed not of intercepted communications or military strategies, but of a future where she and Klaus could walk together in daylight, where their conversations did not have to be hidden, where love could flourish without the constant threat of discovery and destruction. It was an impossible dream in the autumn of 1943, but it was her dream, and she was determined to fight for it in whatever way she could. Whatever way she could. The letter Sarah finally wrote was brief, but carried the weight of months of unspoken feelings. She kept the language careful, coded in ways that would seem innocent to casual observers but would carry deeper meaning to Klaus and Otto. She wrote about literature and architecture, about the beauty she found in German poetry, about her hope that cultural exchange could continue even in difficult times. Finding a way to deliver the letter proved more challenging than writing it. Sarah could not simply approach the fence and hand it over. Too many guards, too many other prisoners, too much risk of discovery. She needed an intermediary, someone who could move between the civilian and military worlds without arousing suspicion. The solution came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who volunteered with the local Red Cross chapter, had mentioned during one of their translation sessions that she sometimes delivered books and educational materials to the prisoner of war camps in the area. She was a widow whose son had died at Normandy, but instead of letting grief turn to hatred, she had channeled her loss into humanitarian work. Sarah approached her carefully, suggesting that she had come across some German literature that might interest the prisoners. Nothing political, she assured Mrs. Patterson, just poetry and philosophy that might provide intellectual stimulation for educated men far from home. Mrs. Patterson agreed readily, pleased to find someone else who understood that treating prisoners humanely was both a legal obligation and a moral imperative. The next Sunday, Sarah watched from her usual position as Mrs. Patterson entered the camp with a small box of books. Among them, carefully hidden between the pages of a volume of Goethe's poetry, was Sarah's letter. She held her breath as she saw Klaus approach the elderly woman, accepting the books with obvious gratitude and carrying them to a quiet corner where Otto waited. Later that same day, as Mrs. Patterson prepared to leave the camp, Otto approached her with a book he wished to return, claiming it was one he had already read. Hidden within its pages was Klaus's response to Sarah's letter, a response that would change everything between them. Klaus's letter was longer than Sarah's, written in careful script that revealed his education and thoughtfulness. He thanked her for reaching out, for providing intellectual companionship in a place where such connections were rare. He wrote about his studies, about the buildings he hoped to design someday when peace returned to the world. But it was in the letter's final paragraphs that Klaus revealed the depth of his feelings. He wrote about how their conversations had awakened something in him that he had thought lost forever, a sense of hope and connection that transcended the circumstances of his captivity. He wrote about how he looked forward to their Sunday meetings not just as intellectual exchanges, but as encounters with someone who saw him as a complete human being rather than simply as enemy prisoner. Most dangerously, most impossibly, he wrote that he was beginning to care for her in ways that went beyond friendship, in ways that made no sense given their situation, but felt more real than anything else in his confined world. Sarah read the letter 3 times before its full meaning settled into her consciousness. Klaus was confessing feelings that mirrored her own, emotions that were as dangerous as they were undeniable. They were falling in love across enemy lines, 2 people whose connection violated every rule of wartime loyalty and civilian duty. That night, Sarah lay awake wrestling with the implications of what was happening between them. She thought about her work, translating enemy communications, about the oath of loyalty she had taken when she accepted her position with the War Department. She thought about her family, about how her parents would react if they discovered she was corresponding with a German prisoner of war. But she also thought about Klaus's gentle intelligence, about Otto's dignified wisdom, about the way these men had challenged her assumptions about enemies and allies, about good and evil. She thought about Klaus's grief for his brother, about his dreams of building beautiful things, about the way he had apologized for crimes he had not committed, but felt connected to nonetheless. The next morning brought news that would complicate their situation further. Sarah arrived at work to find her supervisor waiting with a new assignment that would require extended hours and heightened security clearances. Allied intelligence had intercepted communications suggesting major German troop movements, and translators with Sarah's skills were needed to work around the clock processing the increased volume of intercepted messages. The new schedule would make her Sunday meetings with Klaus and Otto impossible to maintain. Worse, the increased scrutiny that came with her elevated clearance level meant that her activities outside of work would be subject to greater oversight. Any unusual behavior, any suspicious associations, any deviation from expected patterns could trigger investigations that would uncover her connection to the prisoners. Sarah realized she was facing a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could end her relationship with Klaus now, return to the isolated safety of her work and family life, and try to forget about the impossible feelings that had developed between them. Or she could find ways to continue their connection despite the increased risks, accepting that discovery could destroy not only her career but her freedom and possibly her life. The decision came to her not through careful analysis but through immediate emotional recognition of what mattered most. That evening, she wrote another letter to Klaus explaining her new work situation and the increased dangers they've faced. But instead of ending their correspondence, she proposed something even more dangerous: actual meetings, carefully planned encounters outside the camp where they could speak freely without the barrier of fences and guards. The plan she outlined was intricate and risky. Mrs. Patterson's Red Cross work occasionally took her to other facilities in the area, and prisoners were sometimes transported between camps for various administrative reasons. If Klaus could arrange to be part of such a transport, if the timing could be coordinated properly, if a dozen different variables aligned correctly, they might be able to meet in person away from the constraints of the camp. Klaus's response came quickly, carried by Mrs. Patterson along with another delivery of books. He had spoken with Otto and other trusted prisoners about the possibility of arranging temporary transfers. It would require careful planning and significant risks for everyone involved, but it was possible. More importantly, Klaus wrote, it was necessary. Their connection had become too important to abandon, too meaningful to sacrifice to the arbitrary divisions of war. The first meeting was planned for a cold December afternoon at a small park near the Brooklyn waterfront. Klaus would be part of a work detail performing maintenance on port facilities, and Sarah would find a way to be in the area during their lunch break. They would have perhaps 30 minutes together, 30 minutes of direct conversation without fences or guards or the constant fear of discovery. Sarah had never been more nervous about anything in her life as she made her way to the designated meeting spot. She had told her supervisor she was feeling ill and needed to leave work early, a lie that added guilt to her already overwhelming anxiety. She had dressed carefully, wanting to look presentable but not so formal as to attract attention. Klaus was waiting on a bench near the water when she arrived, dressed in civilian clothes that made him look younger and more vulnerable than he had appeared in his prison uniform. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, both overwhelmed by the strangeness of meeting without barriers between them. "You came," Klaus said simply, his voice carrying amazement and relief in equal measure. "I almost did not," Sarah admitted, sitting beside him on the bench but maintaining careful distance. "This is madness. What we are doing could destroy both our lives." Klaus nodded seriously. "I know. But Sarah, these past months of letters, of conversations through the fence, they have been the only thing keeping me sane in that place. You have given me back pieces of myself I thought the war had destroyed forever." They talked quietly as boats moved past on the water, their conversation covering familiar topics from their letters but with new intimacy now that they could speak directly. Klaus told her more about his family, about his childhood in Munich, about the professor who had inspired his love of architecture. Sarah shared stories about her grandmother, about her work before the war, about her dreams of traveling to Europe someday when peace returned. But underneath the surface conversation ran a deeper current of awareness, an acknowledgement of feelings that were growing stronger despite all rational arguments against them. When Klaus reached across the space between them to touch her hand briefly, Sarah felt her heart race with excitement and terror in equal measure. "I think about you constantly," Klaus said quietly, his eyes fixed on the water. "In the camp, during work, details, at night when I cannot sleep. I think about what it would be like if we had met in different circumstances, if we could simply be two people getting to know each other without all these complications." Sarah felt tears threatening. "I think about that too. I imagine meeting you at a bookstore or at a lecture or in a library. I imagine conversations that could last for hours without fear of discovery. I imagine a world where caring for you would not feel like betraying everything I was raised to believe." "Do you regret it?" Klaus asked. "This connection between us? These feelings that make no sense but feel more real than anything else in my life?" Sarah considered the question seriously before answering. "I regret the circumstances. I regret that the world is arranged in such a way that loving you feels like treason. But I do not regret knowing you, Klaus. You have reminded me that there is still beauty and goodness in the world, even when everything seems designed to make us forget that." Their time together passed too quickly, and soon Klaus had to return to his work detail. They parted with careful formality, two people who appeared to be strangers but who carried with them the weight of impossible love. As Sarah walked home through the darkening streets of Brooklyn, she felt changed in ways she could not fully articulate. The meetings continued through the winter, sometimes successful, sometimes impossible due to changing schedules and security concerns. Each encounter deepened their connection while also highlighting the impossibility of their situation. They were falling more deeply in love with each conversation, but they were also becoming more aware of how little future they could realistically hope for. In her diary, Sarah began documenting not just the facts of their meetings, but her evolving understanding of what love could mean in impossible circumstances. She wrote about the way Klaus listened when she spoke about her work, about his gentle questions and thoughtful responses. She wrote about the intelligence she saw in his eyes, the kindness in his voice, the way he made her feel understood in ways no one else ever had. She also wrote about the guilt that plagued her, the sense that she was betraying her family, her country, and the memory of all those who had suffered and died in the war. She struggled with questions that had no clear answers. Could love between enemies ever be justified? Was it possible to maintain loyalty to one's cause while caring for someone on the other side? How could she reconcile her feelings for Klaus with her knowledge of what German forces were doing to Jewish communities across Europe? Klaus, meanwhile, was wrestling with similar questions in his own way. In his letters to Sarah, he wrote about conversations with Otto and other prisoners who were trying to understand their own complicity in events they had not directly caused, but had been part of nonetheless. He wrote about the guilt of survival, of being relatively safe in an American prison camp while his countrymen and enemies alike died on battlefields across the world. Most painfully, he wrote about the growing realization that even if the war ended, even if they both survived, the divisions between them might prove impossible to bridge. He was a German citizen who would likely face years of occupation and reconstruction. She was an American Jewish woman whose people had suffered enormously at German hands. How could they build a life together across such vast gulfs of history and trauma? Yet despite all these rational arguments against their relationship, neither could bring themselves to end it. Their connection had become too central to their sense of identity, too important to their ability to maintain hope in the dark times. They continued meeting when possible, continued writing letters, continued building a relationship that existed in defiance of everything the war had taught them about enemies and allies. Spring arrived early in 1944, bringing with it rumors of major Allied preparations for an invasion of occupied Europe. The increased military activity, meant more restrictions on prisoner movements, fewer opportunities for the carefully orchestrated meetings that had sustained Sarah and Klaus through the winter months. Their correspondence became more frequent and more intense as direct meetings became impossible. Sarah found herself rushing home from work each day, hoping to find a letter hidden in one of Mrs. Patterson's book deliveries. Klaus's letters grew longer and more philosophical, exploring questions about identity, loyalty, and the possibility of redemption in a world that seemed determined to divide people into simple categories of good and evil. In one particularly moving letter, Klaus wrote about a conversation with a new prisoner who had arrived at the camp, a young man captured during fighting in Italy who was struggling with despair and guilt over his role in the war. Klaus described how he had found himself offering the same kind of compassionate understanding that Sarah had shown him, how their relationship had taught him to see past uniforms and nationalities to the human beings underneath. Sarah responded with her own reflections on how their connection had changed her approach to her work. She wrote about finding herself thinking of the German communications she translated not just as enemy intelligence, but as expressions of human beings caught up in circumstances beyond their control. She wrote about the growing complexity of her understanding of war, of how loving Klaus had forced her to confront the limitations of thinking in terms of simple oppositions between good and evil. Their letters became a kind of philosophical dialogue, two intelligent people using their impossible relationship as a lens through which to examine fundamental questions about human nature, loyalty, and the possibility of connection across seemingly unbridgeable divides. They wrote about books they were reading, ideas they were exploring, dreams they harbored for a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. But they also wrote about their deepening feelings for each other, emotions that had grown stronger through separation rather than weaker. Klaus wrote about missing not just their conversations, but her presence, the way she looked when she was thinking deeply about something, the sound of her voice when she spoke German with her grandmother's accent. Sarah wrote about dreams in which she and Klaus walked together through the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, looking at flowers and talking about architecture and poetry without fear of discovery. She wrote about imagining a future where they could share books openly, where their intellectual connection could flourish alongside their emotional bond. As summer approached, both began to sense that their current situation could not continue indefinitely. The war was reaching a critical phase, and the increased security measures at the camp made their correspondence increasingly dangerous. More importantly, they were both struggling with the emotional toll of loving someone they could see only in stolen moments, of building a relationship that might have no future beyond the artificial circumstances that had created it. The crisis came in late June, when Sarah's supervisor informed her that she was being considered for a promotion that would require even higher security clearances and possibly relocation to Washington. The opportunity represented recognition of her valuable skills and dedication, but it would also mean the end of any possibility of maintaining her connection with Klaus. That night, Sarah sat at her desk staring at a blank piece of paper, trying to find words for what might be her final letter to Klaus. How could she explain that duty and opportunity were forcing her to abandon the most meaningful relationship of her life? How could she say goodbye to someone who had become essential to her sense of who she was? The letter she finally wrote was the most honest thing she had ever put on paper. She told Klaus about the promotion opportunity and what it would mean for their ability to maintain contact. She wrote about her love for him, using the word directly for the first time, acknowledging the full depth of feelings she had been trying to keep carefully controlled. She wrote about the impossibility of their situation, about the ways the war had created artificial barriers between them that might prove impossible to overcome even when peace returned. She wrote about her fears that they were building something beautiful that had no foundation in the real world, something that could only exist in the strange, suspended reality of wartime. But she also wrote about what he had given her, how he had restored her faith in human goodness, how he had taught her that love could flourish even in the most unlikely circumstances. She wrote, about her gratitude for their connection regardless of whether it could survive the end of the war and the return to normal life. Klaus's response when it came was equally honest and equally heartbreaking. He wrote about his own fears for the future, about the likelihood that he would be repatriated to a Germany that would be devastated and occupied, where he would face years of reconstruction and denazification. He wrote about the possibility that they might never see each other again, that their love might remain forever suspended in the strange circumstances that had created it. But he also wrote about the certainty of his feelings, about how loving her had changed him in fundamental ways that would persist regardless of what the future held. He wrote about carrying her with him always, about the way their connection had taught him to believe in the possibility of human goodness, even in the darkest times. In his final paragraph, Klaus made a promise that would haunt both of them in the months to come. He wrote that he would find a way to see her one more time before her departure for Washington, that he would risk everything for one final meeting, where they could say goodbye properly, where they could acknowledge what they had meant to each other without the constraints of letters and hidden messages. The promise was impossible and dangerous, but it was also irresistible. As Sarah read Klaus's words, she knew that she would wait for that final meeting, that she would risk her career and her freedom for one more conversation with the man who had taught her that love could transcend even the most impossible circumstances. The war was entering its final phase, and their relationship was approaching its climax, but neither Sarah nor Klaus could have anticipated how dramatically their story would unfold in the weeks to come. The promised meeting came sooner than either expected, but under circumstances that neither could have imagined. On a humid July evening, as Sarah walked home from what she had decided would be her final visit to the fence at Prospect Park, she heard footsteps behind her on the darkened path. Her heart stopped when she turned to see Klaus emerging from the shadows between the trees. He was alone, dressed in civilian clothes that hung loosely on his frame, his face drawn with exhaustion and something that looked like desperation. "How did you get out?" she whispered, looking around frantically for signs of guards or pursuit. "There was an incident at the camp, a fire in one of the storage buildings. In the confusion, I simply walked away. Otto created a distraction, told the guards I was helping with the wounded. By the time they realized I was missing, I was already here." Klaus's voice was steady, but Sarah could see the tremor in his hands. "They will be looking for you everywhere. This is madness, Klaus. You could be shot for escaping." "I know." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the intensity in his eyes. "But I could not let you disappear to Washington without saying goodbye properly. I could not let this end with nothing but letters and stolen glances through wire." Sarah felt tears she had been holding back for weeks finally spill over. "What are we doing? This cannot work. There is no future for us. No way this can end except in disaster." Klaus reached out tentatively, touching her face with gentle fingers. "Perhaps you are right. Perhaps we are building something that cannot survive in the daylight world. But Sarah, these months with you have been the most real thing in my life. Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever the future holds, I needed you to know that completely." They stood facing each other in the gathering darkness, two people balanced on the edge of a precipice they could not see clearly. The sounds of the city continued around them, cars passing on nearby streets, distant voices calling children home for dinner, the ordinary sounds of a world that seemed impossibly removed from their extraordinary situation. "I have been offered a position with the State Department," Sarah said quietly. "Intelligence work, but focused on post-war reconstruction planning. They want me in Washington within the month." "You should take it. You should build the career you deserve, help create whatever comes after all this destruction." Klaus's voice carried conviction despite the pain in his eyes. "You have gifts that the world needs, Sarah. Do not sacrifice them for something as uncertain as this." "And what about you? What happens when they catch you? Because they will catch you, Klaus. You cannot hide in Brooklyn forever." Klaus was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I have been thinking about that. There are ways, people who help in these situations. Otto has contacts, other prisoners who have made arrangements. It is possible to disappear, to start over with new papers, a new identity." Sarah stared at him in shock. "You are talking about deserting completely, about abandoning any chance of returning home when the war ends?" "What home?" Klaus asked with bitter honesty. "Germany will be occupied, devastated, full of people trying to forget what they did or what they allowed to happen. My family believes I am dead already. My dreams of architecture, of building beautiful things, those died in the Africa Corps. What exactly would I be returning to? Your country, your language, your culture, everything that made you who you are." "You made me who I am," Klaus said simply. "These months of knowing you, of seeing myself through your eyes, of learning what it means to connect with someone across impossible divides, that is who I am now. And I cannot go back to being who I was before." The weight of his words settled between them like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples in all directions. Sarah understood that Klaus was not just talking about escaping from prison camp, but about abandoning his entire previous identity in favor of something new and uncertain. "What are you asking me to do?" she said, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "I am asking you to consider the impossible, to think about whether there might be a way for us to build something together, away from all of this." Klaus gestured toward the distant lights of the camp, toward the city beyond, toward the war that had brought them together and now threatened to tear them apart. "You are asking me to give up everything. My career, my family, my entire life. To run away with an escaped enemy prisoner and hope we can somehow disappear into a country that would see our relationship as treason." "Yes," Klaus said quietly. "That is exactly what I am asking. And I know it is impossible. I know it is unfair. I know it makes no sense. But Sarah, I love you in ways I did not know were possible. I love your intelligence, your compassion, your courage in reaching across the fence to see me as human. I love the way you speak German with your grandmother's accent, the way you think about books and ideas, the way you have taught me to hope for something better than the hatred that brought us to this point." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the full weight of the choice he was presenting. Everything rational in her mind screamed against even considering such a plan. She thought about her parents, about their pride in her work for the war effort, about how devastated they would be if she simply vanished. She thought about her brother David, still fighting somewhere in the Pacific, about how her disappearance might affect his morale and his safety. But she also thought about the months of connection with Klaus, about conversations that had awakened parts of herself she had not known existed. She thought about the loneliness of her work, the isolation of processing information about atrocities while being unable to act directly to prevent them. She thought about the possibility of building something entirely new with someone who understood her in ways no one else ever had. "Where would we go?" she heard herself asking, amazed that she was even considering the question. "West. There are communities of German immigrants who came here long before the war, people who understand what it means to start over in America. Otto has connections with people who help refugees, who understand that not everyone on the wrong side of this war deserves to be destroyed by it. And what would we do? How would we live?" Klaus smiled for the first time since appearing in the park. "You would continue working with languages, with translation, with the skills that make you valuable to any organization that needs to bridge different cultures. I would find work with my hands, with building and construction, until I could establish myself enough to return to architecture. We would be quiet, careful people living quiet, careful lives. But we would be together." Sarah opened her eyes and looked at him. This man, who was asking her to abandon everything familiar for the possibility of something unprecedented. In the darkness of the park, with the sounds of ordinary life continuing around them, the plan seemed almost possible. Two people in love, finding a way to be together despite circumstances designed to keep them apart. Sarah and Klaus stood at the crossroads of an impossible decision, their love story suspended between the brutal realities of war and the fragile hope of human connection. In the end, love found a way through the darkness, proving that even in humanity's most divided moments, two hearts can discover something worth fighting for across any divide. Their secret bond reminds us that beneath the uniforms and ideologies that separate us, we are all searching for the same thing. Someone who sees us as completely, beautifully human.